You are watching the Deadfoot Diver Podcast with Curt the Deadfoot Diver.
So when you're cave diving and when you're getting ready to do all these deep dives and stuff like that, do you guys a lot of the focus I've noticed since I started diving again this year is a trend towards not teaching dive tables and not teaching um, the risks of decompression sickness,
Ouch.
and basically saying, "Here's your computer, follow your computer." What
Ouch.
what's your opinion on that?
Well, I guess I'm an old school purist. I mean, when I learned tech diving and trimix and everything, it was all manual calculated tables, and you calculated your tables, you calculated your 10-foot deeper tables, you had all kinds of contingencies all manually mapped out, you calculated oxygen exposures manually, and so I want people to understand, like what is the computer doing? Like a lot of people who get into tech diving, there's a lot of concepts that are quite foreign, whether it's your gradient factors or whatever else. And most people go, "Oh yeah, I understand gradient factors." It's just like, probably not. But so I'm gonna do this lecture anyway, and hopefully make this simpler. So you have to understand what that device is doing, and you have to have a plan for how you're going to manage yourself if it fails. There are a lot of people who just kind of jump in the water and do what the computer tells them, as opposed to even pre-planning a dive. And I'm a real fan of plans and checklists.
Especially diving rebreathers. I mean,
Oh God, yeah, it's inexcusable if you don't use a checklist. Like, and I feel very well qualified to say, you know what? After 8,000 dives, I still use a checklist every time I use that rebreather, and it's not a matter of like I could tell you that checklist word for word right now, but we get distracted and
yep.
we're out in a beautiful world. Someone needs a mouthpiece, someone needs something, and suddenly you've cut that checklist in half in your brain, so it should be on paper, or electronic, whatever method, but you should be going through something that's physical, that's a reminder, because human errors are human errors because we're human and we make mistakes, and so I feel my life is worth preventing those mistakes.
Yeah, I mean,
Checklists
the
help.
consequences of a rebreather are serious death. I mean,
Yeah,
there's no
and
way
we
around it.
and we
And I
don't
mean,
find dead guys with checklists. Like,
no.
yeah,
It's I mean,
yeah.
I had John Chatterton on the other day and he said the same thing. He says every death on the dory is diver error.
Of course, yeah. And you know what? When we look at rebreather failures and issues that caused a death, we can look at the true root cause of these accidents and find that 90% of those issues could have been prevented by an action taken before the person went in the water. So they made a bad decision on the surface. It had nothing to do with what happened underwater.
So when you're prepping for a rebreather dive,
Mm.
how many days before are you starting to work on your gear and do checklists? Because I've heard people say that like if they're diving on Saturday, they're starting to check their gear and go through their checklist multiple times starting on like Monday.
Yeah, I mean, it's just through experience. Stuff can happen, or I mean, yeah, I've got to do an annual service, of course, on my rebreather every year, and so that's part of the preparation. I need to get the rebreather together, but I also need to get me and the rebreather together too. So I may need to jump in the river out back and just refresh my skills as well if they're rusty. So yeah, it does depend, but definitely, like, even if I'm fresh and constant and everything else, I like to have the rebreather ready the night before and tested, and then it's a quick retest in the morning before I go diving, because it's just nice to go to sleep knowing there's no issues. Because I've said this before. In fact, it's a bit of a grim story. Like, this would be about almost 20 years ago. I was sitting on a boat when my Optima rebreather that I was diving at the time failed just as I was about to jump in the water, and it had passed its pre-dive checks. And I went, oh, huh. And I sat down and everyone was like, what's going on? And I said, oh, my rebreather just failed. So I'm, sorry, I'm going to be snorkeling. It's a little too close to, jump time to deal with this. And they're like, oh, but you can run it manually. And I'm like, yeah, I can run it manually, but I'm not going to. If there's one thing you learn from me, I do not jump in the water with something that's already broken. Like if you had a checklist that says this is the minimum requirement for the rebreather to go diving, then you got to stick with it. So 2 out of 3 sensors means you sit on the bench and you don't go diving, where a lot of people have gone diving with 2 out of 3 sensors and then ultimately didn't come home.
Yeah, I've talked to several people who have known of people who passed away using rebreathers. When I was younger, I absolutely wanted to do a rebreather. It was because at the time it was cutting edge and stuff. And not only that, the depth restrictions that it enabled and how long I'd be able to stay underwater for. Now with my old age, or since I'm 55, I mean, I'm not old.
I'm older than you are.
Yeah. Yeah, you're a couple of years older than me.
I'm a few years older. Yeah.
So, but with that, and also I have ADHD, so I mean, I forget stuff, especially when I'm excited about doing something or whatever.
Yeah.
For the podcast, eventually, I'm hoping I'm gonna get to do a rebreather session in a pool, like to do it just to try it and experience it.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure after everybody I've talked to about rebreathers and the preparation and the checklists involved, I'm gonna be out after that point.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It's not for everybody. And as I said before, it's a tool. And so if it's a tool that enables a type of diving that you're ready for and want to engage in, great. But yeah, it's not for everybody and it's not needed by everybody. It's a big investment.
oh yeah, they're definitely not cheap. I
Yeah.
mean, even the cheapest ones I've seen going, you're looking at thousands.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, I also want to touch a bit on your ex-husband, Paul Heinerth, another legendary cave explorer. So, what was it like working with your spouse and the challenges of that when you're trying to do certain dives? I mean, maybe you want to actually recount the story about when you were on the ship to the Arctic with him.
Oh, to Antarctica. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, poor Paul. Yeah, Paul gets horribly seasick, and he is also French Canadian, and so English was not his first language, and people forget that because his English seems perfect, but there's some little nuances of the language that he sometimes misses. And I had told him that we had a 12-day crossing to Antarctica from New Zealand, and he thought 12-day crossing meant 6 days down and 6 days back, and after he'd probably lost 15 pounds at this point, he was being so seasick, he grabbed me and said, "You lied to me." And I'm like, no, 12-day crossings mean 12 days down, then the project, and 12 days home across the most violent seas on the planet. So I don't know if he ever forgave me for that. But the more seriously though, the question you're asking is about diving with your partner, and that's difficult. It's extremely difficult. You may make decisions that are different with your partner, whether it's your spouse, or whether it's your child, or whether it's your dad, or someone that's incredibly close to you. You have to really think about how it may change your risk envelope. Like I remember doing an expedition dive with Paul, and he was really frustrated with the technology that we were using. It was really hard to to pilot, and he was frustrated, and he was cursing and swearing, and then we also kept getting separated because he was just having a struggle with some of this gear. And so I would get ahead of him, and then I would kind of circle back, and that was just pissing him off through frustration. But both of us were just diving with so much stuff, literally like 500-600 pounds of gear we were dragging through this cave. And I heard him cursing and swearing, and I took it very personally. Like, I thought he was mad at me for getting ahead, and I found myself, 300 feet deep on a 20-hour dive, and I'm crying, right? Because I think he's mad at me, my husband. And, was he? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe not. But the end result was, like, I found myself in this emotional state that was completely ridiculous for the task at hand. Like, I know now that you got to leave the emotions behind. You got to leave them on the surface. And maybe you can't do that with your spouse or your child or your parent or whatever. And if that's the case, then maybe you should each dive with someone else. And on that project, I came to that conclusion. I said, I think the world of you, your skills are unbelievable. And there's nobody that's more angelic in the underwater environment than he is. But I couldn't partner with him for such big dives. And it wasn't the end of our diving. I mean, even after we were divorced, I hired him for a bunch of projects for film things. And it wasn't that we couldn't dive together. It was just in those huge risk situations, it was difficult. In fact, I found it easier after we were divorced. There wasn't the emotional baggage attachment that really made the risk greater.
I could see that with the danger involved. I mean, especially having your spouse. It was funny. I interviewed Greg Hilliard the other day, and I had him talk about diving with his spouse.
Yeah.
And same issue. It's he's like, yeah, your emotional levels on a total different state when you're diving with your spouse, partner, or anybody that you're really close to.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's like you're trying to impress them. Maybe it's you're trying to, be as good, or maybe it's something else. Who knows? It's just a baggage that you bring from the surface underwater with you. So maybe it's best to leave that behind, because oftentimes we're better buddies with those we're not as close to. Like, I have some really close buddies, but we're super authentic and honest and straightforward with each other in a way that funny enough just doesn't translate as well when someone's too close.
No, I totally get that. Especially when it comes to your putting your life in their hands, or vice versa.
Well, I mean, that's the other difficult thing. What's going to happen if there's a crisis, if there's an emergency? Like, are you going to end up dead too? Like, are you, what happens at that moment that you realize you can't save that other person? And then even just the guilt that you would carry, even if you were not a party to their accident, like not being able to save your partner. Like, do you really ever want to go through that? Like, I don't know. Yeah.
I can't imagine that. Especially even just listening to you about when I've listened to your interviews about you recovering, how many friends that you've had to recover from cave diving.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's bad enough when it's a friend, but if it was your family, your spouse, like, whew, I'd rather just prevent that situation.
Yeah, I totally.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Deadfoot Diver. Subscribe and share. Your support means the world to me. If you'd like to contribute directly, you can do so at the link in the description at buymeacoffee.com/deadfootdiver. Every donation helps me work towards earning my adaptive dive buddy certification, travel costs to help me assist other adaptive divers, and covering further training and equipment costs, bringing you on even more exciting adventures. Don't forget to check out my guest links in the description. And remember, grab an adventure and live.
So let's talk a bit about Tobermory, because I know that
Yeah,
since this is a Canadian podcast, and I know that you've done a lot of diving up in Tobermory.
that's where I got certified. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It's actually, I live actually just an hour and a half south of Tobermory.
Oh,
So
right.
for me, it's awesome. I finish work at like, when I do finish work, I finish work at like 9:30 in the morning. I can be
Hmm.
up at Tobermory to like do an afternoon charter or go diving right after. So it's amazing.
Nice, nice.
So I know that you got certified up there. You
Hmm.
do a lot of diving up there. Even still, I understand
Hmm.
that you come
Hmm.
up there a fair amount to do diving. So what's your favorite shipwreck up there to dive on? Why?
Oh, I've they're all great. I mean, I love just jumping in the water at the tugs, even just because it's so accessible, or the sweepstakes, right? Like shore dives with really cool looking wrecks. But I've just always had this like warm spot in my heart for the Arabia and the Forest City. But pretty much everybody does, I think. Yeah.
The Arabia is an amazing dive.
Well, when I learned to dive, it was before zebra and quagga mussels, and you might have experienced this too, where you go down the line to the Arabia and you'd hit this big cement block. And at the time, there wasn't a line that led from the cement block to the wreck. Mind you, it was only about 2 meters away,
Yeah.
if that. But back in those days, you'd hit the block and you couldn't see the wreck. And,
Oh yeah.
a couple of meters of visibility was sort of normal up there. Like the invasive mussels changed all of that. And so it's a whole lot easier dive now, but it was quite mysterious and really fascinating back then, but I still love it. Yeah.
Well, for those of you that don't know about the Arabia is a schooner that sank in the 1800s.
Hmm.
It is relatively intact. It's an amazing wreck to dive on. I've actually gone night diving on it a couple of times
Yeah. Cool.
back in the day. I'm actually really excited because this year, one of my goals is that actually I'm going to do the Arabia again this year, because I
Excellent.
haven't done it in so
Yeah.
long. And
Yeah.
you cannot, for anybody who hasn't dove it, I mean, you can't explain what it's like when you come up on the wreck, and especially when you see the bowsprit with the
Yeah. That's the
chains
prettiest.
hanging down on it.
Right. Right. That's the prettiest part. Yeah. 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 It has changed a lot in 25, 30 more than that years. It is kind of starting to fall apart a little bit more, but it's still so cool. And now, I mean, you can see it stem to stern. You're descending on it, and pretty quickly for the surface, you're like, oh, wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah, that's what I'm really looking forward to this year, because I've never
Yeah.
seen it that clear up
Right,
there.
that way. Yeah.
And even at the tugs this year, I was amazed at the visibility up there, and right at the
Yeah.
water temperature.
I know. A few years ago, like when I first moved back to Canada, like 6, 7 years ago, I was up in Tobermory and I saw people like just snorkeling at the tugs in bathing suits.
Yep.
First of all, they could see all of them from the surface and just snorkeling around. Second of all, they were in bathing suits, like, in the water at Tobermory. Something that it's a lot warmer on the surface now, and they were in the water a long time.
I remember, like, when I first started diving at Tobermory back in the day when you did, like,
Yeah.
how cold it was regardless of how deep you were.
Yes.
And I mean,
Yeah.
on my computer, I have multiple dives where the water temperature above the thermocline was 73 degrees this year.
That's crazy because it was always like on the bottom, it was always 4. It was just always right? Like 4C. Yeah, and it wasn't a whole lot warmer coming up. Yeah, it's
E-
crazy.
Every single dive instructor I made friends with at Divers Den this year
Yeah,
could not believe
how
how
warm.
warm the water was up there.
Yeah, it's a bit
Which,
worrying.
yeah, actually, that was my next question for you. Actually, is what do you think about all the effects of global warming on the marine environment? Because the
Mm.
temperatures are staggering.
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, people of our age and number of years diving shouldn't have seen so many changes in the environment, not just locally, but all around the world, whether it's, coral reefs and bleaching and stony coral disease, or whether it's, clarity in the Great Lakes and collapse of the, native species population in the Great Lakes, or whether it's the loss of sea ice in the north. It's extraordinary, the things that are changing. But, I think that us as sort of people of the water planet, the water warriors, that we have an opportunity to share these insights, these stories that maybe will awaken others who don't see the changes that we do to the existential threats that we as a species are facing as a result of these changes in the climate.
So what do you, out of all the places that you've dove repeatedly,
Mm-hmm.
where have you gone back recently and then gone, oh my God, I can't believe the damage due to global warming and stuff like that, or to hurricanes, or which
Yeah,
I mean is also part of this
yeah.
global warming stuff, the amount of hurricanes that we get now.
It's at both extremes of the planet. Like we see less of those changes in the middle latitudes of Canada, for instance. Like we can still go out west and see all the incredible charismatic megafauna and everything, even though some of the environment has changed there. Same thing on the East Coast. But if you go to the north and you see the loss of sea ice, it's palpable year on year. It's setting up later each year, it's breaking up earlier each year, and it's changing the entire, marine regimen there. And then the same thing at the warm ends of the planet in the tropics, like where, I really, really cut my teeth in diving was when I lived in the Cayman Islands for a few years. And it was this amazing, beautiful, resplendent, healthy coral environment on the east end of Grand Cayman. But now it is really stressed, and it's shocking to me to see the changes in the tropical environments.
So do you think that part of that is also from the amount of diving activity that some of these locations get?
No, I mean, yes, in the sense that like sunscreen is a horrible, horrible thing that harms the marine environment. Yeah, but diver traffic, that is not what's driving the global existential threats right now. Yes, there are stressed sites from physical impacts of divers, and then also from the sunscreen they're wearing on their bodies or whatever else. But that's site specific. That's like sort of looking at weather versus climate. It's like it's windy today, it's snowy today, it's rainy today. One day's good, one day's bad. But it's really climate. The changes over time that are important. And in the diving, it's the global changes in the marine environment that are frightening in places where divers have never been, whether it's microplastic pollutions, warming oceans, ocean acidification. That's all global stuff. You could live in the prairie provinces and be affecting the ocean with your behaviors on land. Yeah, you don't have to be a diver.
Yeah, a lot of people don't think of that aspect of that. Even though you're not a diver, you're affecting the environment when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah.
And it blows my mind how you still see all these people on the news and stuff like that who are saying, oh, that this whole climate change thing is a farce, etc. How do you even dispute that when there's the record number of hurricanes and more severe storms and flooding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when we were making the film Diving into the Darkness in the last couple of years, everywhere we went around the world to do our filming, we came up against these like 100-year, 1,000-year weather events. And atmospheric river in New Zealand, for instance, and it's like, wow, tropical cyclone down there that filled the airport with waist deep water.
Wow.
Yeah, so all I would say is like, hey, just observe the changes in your own local environment. They're happening everywhere now. There's absolutely no doubt.
Yeah. So I want to move on a bit about
Mhm.
your Diving into the Darkness movie.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me about it, because I've only seen a couple of clips of it,
Mhm.
unfortunately, because I missed the online screening of it last summer when it was
No
on.
worries. Yeah. Well, hopefully
So,
soon we'll have a streaming deal and we'll get it streaming globally. But yeah, yeah. Well, the project started, I guess, when I met the director about 7, 8 years ago now, when I was in Australia speaking. And during the COVID times, he read my book and said, "Oof, I want to make a movie about your life." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." Like, it's a bit scary. But we developed this incredible friendship, Nays Bagai and I gave him access to all my archives. And he is an extraordinarily talented filmmaker. And when it came time to film, we had my archival materials, but we still needed to travel around the world and do some recreations and get some new footage and then put it all together. So this past year, we've been traveling around the world doing festivals and little bespoke screenings just to get the marketing started. And we've been winning a ton of awards, which is kind of exciting.
I seen that. I seen you just picked up another award in Alaska.
Yeah, we did. We
So,
did.
I mean, your travel schedule is insane.
It's been a bit much.
Is it, are you normally this busy every year? Or is it extra busy because now you've got all this media stuff to do with the
It's been a little bit extra this year, but I'm happy to kind of just now take a chill pill, slow down for a bit, because I've got so much, filming and expedition work going on as well in between all of these, media type trips, and I'll let go of some of that and just focus on the expeditions this year.
Well, I'm very glad that you've taken time to join me here, because I know your schedule's super busy
Yeah, my
uh,
pleasure.
and stuff like that. So I understand a little common acquaintance that we have actually mentioned that you are probably coming to Tobermory, actually diving this summer, I heard.
Yeah, yeah. So Sylvia, who's works for Blue Heron Company and will be running Divers Den, has said, "Hey, come on back up." And I'm like, "I'll be there." Maybe we could figure out how to do a screening up in Tobermory too.
That
We'll work
that would
on it.
be awesome. That, I'm
Yeah,
sure you would definitely sell out at that.
yeah. I think
Um,
that'd be a fun thing to do. Go back to the scene of the crime.
well, well, make sure that when you're up here, hopefully you can let me know so that I can make the drive up and get my book signed from you.
Oh, you bet. Yeah,
And
you bet.
if you have any now, Hubert didn't want me to do any side mount stuff with any other instructor type thing, so I wouldn't pick up any bad habits. However, I think in this case, he's trumped. So I'll have my side mount certification by then. So if you have time to
Cool.
go for a dive, I
Yeah.
would love to get some critiquing.
Cool. Let's do it. Let's
All
do
right,
it.
that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Awesome.
So, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. I know that your time is extremely valuable and busy. And I have thoroughly enjoyed this. It has been a
Oh, me
total
too.
honor to have you on the show. And I'm looking forward to meeting you this summer when you're coming up to Tobermory.
Yeah, let's
And
make it
by the
happen.
way, I'm going to have all of Jill's links down below the video here so that you can check our podcasts or newsletters, all that type of stuff. So thank you very much for joining the Deadfoot Podcast, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, Jill.